Hey guys, Sci-Fi Guy 2094 here. Today I have a very interesting topic for discussion. It's going to be kind of relating to the video that I posted last, and today I'm going to be talking about a hypothetical situation, okay? This is hypothetical. This is just, to get your mind thinking about different possibilities, where this nation is headed, and well, quite frankly, the world in general. But my question for today and the topic of discussion is, what if the Hunger Games were real? So let's talk about this. I'm just using this one as an example because they actually explain why they came up with the Hunger Games. Peter Dinklage's character felt so much guilt about coming up with these games because he knew it was so absurd and like so heartless and cruel, and eventually, yeah, he couldn't really live with himself with whenever he figured out that the government was actually going to take his idea and turn it into a reality. It killed him, and he basically became like an alcoholic, basically, because he kept trying to deal with the guilt of creating the Hunger Games. But anyway, this is my visual aid for today. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys an example, okay? So let's say, and I kind of talked about this in the last video, let's say you have like January 6 rioters, and hypothetically, for this situation of the United States that we're living in, they still get a trial, they still get to defend themselves, they have lawyers, all these things. So it's not just the federal government accusing them of something and they don't get any representation, okay? So let's say they get representation, they have a lawyer, they plead guilty or whatever, they plead not guilty rather, and there's a commission and they're found to have incited an insurrection against Joe Biden because he was the president being certified, and they tried to stop that. Now, I know Democrats would love to watch January 6ers compete in the Hunger Games. That is without question. I know for a fact that they would want to see the January 6ers punished and compete in the Hunger Games. But my question is, well, what if you're like a Trump supporter, but you're not exactly, you didn't agree with what they did on January 6th. So you like Trump, let's say you voted for him, you like some of his policies or most of his policies, and you agree with him most of the time, but you do believe that January 6th was a terrible event that should have never happened. Now, as a Trump supporter, would you be watching the Hunger Games? Like, would you be, impartial towards the contestants on the Hunger Games? Which, in this situation, this scenario, in this hypothetical, would be the January 6 rioters. Would you be rooting for them? Or would you just say, you know what, they need to accept the punishment for what they did and just watch the games just because? Now, that is the hypothetical situation. Now, personally, I'd be curious as to these games, how they would actually be held. So out of curiosity, I'd be like, okay, well, these people, they did this insurrection, and okay, they got a chance to defend themselves, but this is their punishment. Let me watch the Hunger Games. Let me see what happens. Now, again, this is all a hypothetical situation, right? In America, okay? I'm not saying I'm advocating for this to happen, but people do die in the Hunger Games, right? I'm talking about the film here, okay? They do die in Hunger Games, okay? So, in America, hypothetically, if we're watching these games, are we really going to be cheering if somebody, one of the rioters gets killed in the Hunger Games? I again, I know Democrats will be cheering at that's for certain. But I'm talking about, like, say you're like independent or you're like a Republican and you're watching these games. Would you be cheering when somebody bites the dust, or would you just kind of be watching it just to like see it all unfold? And eventually, the games do become stale in this movie, and they have to come up with a way to try to get the ratings back up because ratings are falling year after year. So basically, they get somebody to sponsor one of the contestants, and they pair them together so it becomes more personable, so the crowd has somebody to root for, and they're hoping that gets their ratings up. So that's what happens in this movie. So would you be the same way? Like, would you want there to be some type of um, pairing between, like, say like a politician or an activist and then one of the people that are competing in the Hunger Games? So there's kind of food for thought. If the Hunger Games were real in America today, would you watch them? Why or why not? Okay. Second topic of discussion is kind of similar to the Hunger Games, and that is, what if the Running Man were real? Okay. So if you guys remember the old Running Man movie from the 1980s with Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was falsely accused. Okay, so he was accused of like firing on civilians. He was like a military personnel, and they framed him for firing on civilians. They altered the audio, and he was basically saying, no, you can't fire, there are civilians down there. So he was trying to preserve life, but the government framed him and said he fired on civilians. It made him compete in the Running Man, even though he was totally innocent. He clears his name eventually in the end, but that's just like a little background story of the plot of the film, in case you guys have not seen that. They're actually rebooting that one with Glenn Powell, which I really want to see. So I'm looking forward to that one. But let's say we're going more towards like individuals, like who have committed a crime. And again, hypothetically, they get representation, they get a lawyer, they get a court date, they get all these things. Let's say they're found guilty, and they have to compete in the Running Man against like assassins or mercenaries or police officers or army personnel. Again, this is a hypothetical in America, right? So they've committed their crimes, they've been tried, they've been found guilty, and now they have to compete in the Running Man. Would you watch this of, individual criminals that have, done terrible things, scumbags? For example, you had that sick individual on the subway. This was like North Carolina or something like that. I forget where it was. But he just stood up, he pulled out a knife, and he basically just plunged it into this Ukrainian lady's neck who was just sitting there, She didn't say one thing to this guy. She was just sitting there minding her own business. He just took out a knife, and he did what he did. Now, let's say this situation, it's on video, he gets tried, convicted, and he has to compete in the Running Man. Personally, I would want to watch that because the guy would not deserve prison, in my opinion. He would need to compete as the Running Man and have to face these people. And personally, I do believe that these games they should be stacked. The odds should be stacked against the criminal in this opinion. So, in this situation. So rather this guy who like stabbed this lady in the neck, he should have to fight like a ton of like heavily armed people, and he should be at the disadvantage, right? Because of what he did was completely wrong. I don't know how anybody could justify walking up and just stabbing somebody in the neck for no reason. I'm not sure why some people started a GoFundMe page for this lunatic, but it seems they're also sick in the head as well if they're trying to defend this guy. So I would watch this. I'd want him to get his just desserts and face justice for basically taking an innocent person's life. Let's do another hypothetical. Let's say this guy, let's say he's like a 40, 50-year-old man. Let's say there's a little kid walking home from school, and he snatches the kid, and he does an unspeakable sexual act to this child and traumatizes this child for the rest of his or her life. And this guy, say they have his DNA and he gets convicted and everything, he's made to compete in the Running Man. I would want to watch that because, firstly, scum like that don't deserve to be walking the earth. I would be rooting for his downfall. And yeah, let's just say that. Now, again, I have to talk about, political violence. Well, do we really want to become a society that starts to glorify these games of people that have committed crimes, even sometimes heinous or unspeakable crimes against, normal citizens? If we watch these games, are we going to become hardened, and are we just going to become as cruel as the people that we're putting away in jail and the people that are made to compete in these games? So we have to be careful, like, okay, well, we're getting so much enjoyment out of these games. Are we going to become a violent society that just glorifies violence now? Yeah, these people did terrible things by killing people or, committing sexual assault or whatever the case may be. Drive-by shootings that kill little kids, stray bullets. I think a few years ago, Dwayne Wade's cousin was like walking her children to like registration for school, and she was like hit by a stray bullet and died while trying to take her kids to like register for school. Tragic situation. But anyway, scumbags like that, do we want to actually glorify them competing in like the Running Man or the Hunger Games, and do we just want to become as cold and calloused as they are, just because we want them to have justice enacted against them? At that point, is it justice or is it vengeance? We have to think about that. So that's just my take on the situation with political violence. Again, this is hypothetical. I'm talking about Hunger Games, The Running Man, because they're interesting sci-fi movies. But I would just like to get your opinion on, would you watch these games, the Hunger Games and The Running Man? If they were real, would you want to see these criminals that do terrible things to people, would you want to see them be punished for their actions? And if you do, I don't blame you, because I'm kind of in the same camp in certain situations. Like I said, you have all this gang violence in like LA, Chicago, all types of cities, New York, mass shootings, school shootings. A lot of these times they don't hit their intended targets, and these innocent bystanders are just caught in the crossfire. And little kids playing at a park, and they get shot and killed by, people, just idiots doing idiotic things, and gun violence is just ravaging these communities. Hardly any of the time they're ever found, but I just saw a video today where, I believe this was in Memphis, these two guys got out of the car. You can search for this video. You could probably just type in Memphis shooting in broad daylight, and these two guys get out of the car. They've got like semi-automatic, which are, a semi-automatic is basically like a handgun, a standard handgun. Unless it's like a revolver, it's basically a semi-automatic weapon. But they have what are called switches, which it's a device that can turn it into a fully automatic weapon, basically like an AK-47. And these guys get out of the car and they're just like spraying bullets at somebody, and this is broad daylight, middle of the day. Absolutely insane. So imagine if like a kid was walking down the street and this kid gets hit with a bullet and killed. You know, we have video evidence, we have the license plate. Imagine these guys get caught and they're sentenced to compete in the Running Man. Now personally, I'd want to see these guys pay the price for what they did. If they killed an innocent old lady or an innocent person, it doesn't really matter who, but I use kids as an example because kids are innocent for the most part. They're just, you know, they're just living their lives. They're going to school. They're not bad. Most kids aren't bad. So it's like, if these thugs killed an innocent person, I'd want to see them pay for their crimes. And I would want to see them be punished. And I'd want to see them get what's coming to them in the Running Man or the Hunger Games. So personally, I do believe these people need to face punishment for their actions. But as I mentioned earlier, what type of society do we have to be to start glorifying these Hunger Games and making a spectacle out of it, and watching people fight for their lives and kill each other and things like that? Are we becoming depraved? Are we no better than the people that are committing the crimes at that point? So that's just something to think about. Again, I think I have to keep mentioning this as a disclaimer. I'm only hypothetically speaking about the United States of America if we were to hold Hunger Games. I'm not saying we should. I'm not saying we should hold Hunger Games or Running Man games. This is for entertainment purposes only. I am not advocating that we start our own Hunger Games in America. This is just a hypothetical video for discussion. So anyway, that is the topic for today. You guys have heard my opinion. Personally, I think people should pay for their actions, and I will leave it at that. But what do you guys think? Leave your comment down below and we will have discussion about it.